Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
Hi everyone, my name's Brandon, and I need to get this off my chest because I still can't believe how things went down at the family reunion last weekend. I don't expect sympathy. I just want to share the story because it's been eating at me for years. So, a little context first. I'm 29, and my older sister, Kasha, has always been the golden child of the family, though my parents never exactly used that term. From the moment she graduated high school, she seemed to get everything handed to her. College paid for, internships arranged, job opportunities one only heard about in passing. Meanwhile, I worked a full-time job after college, saved every penny, and had to fight for every opportunity one got. Growing up, it was subtle at first. Birthday presents were always bigger for her. My parents would brag about her achievements constantly. And even when I did something worth noticing, it was always undercut with, well, Kasha did that last year. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I'd realized that no matter what I did, she'd always be the favored one in their eyes. This past weekend, we had a family reunion at my parents' house, a sprawling place in a nice part of town that I had honestly been saving up for years to afford myself one day. As soon as I walked in, I noticed how everyone was already fawning over Kasha. She was telling stories about her latest promotion, how she'd just got back from a business trip that sounded more like a luxury vacation, and how lucky she was that things just seemed to fall into her lap. At first, I tried to ignore it, focusing on small talk with cousins and distant relatives. But Kasha wasn't subtle about it. She leaned back in her chair, glass of sparkling water in hand, and said with a smirk, "I just don't know why everything works out for me. Some people have all the luck, and some don't. Poor Brandon, always working so hard, but never getting ahead like me." The words stung, but I kept my face neutral. My parents, of course, laughed along, nodding like they agreed. I wanted to say something, but I held back. There's a lot more satisfaction in timing, I've learned. The dinner went on, and the tension built slowly. Kasha started talking about her latest plans. She casually mentioned she'd been eyeing the old family house that had been in my parents' name for years. She said she'd hoped to buy it someday, and my parents immediately started talking about how perfect it would be for her, how she could host events there, and how it's always been her dream. Every word was like a needle in my side, and I felt something in me snap, but in a very calm, controlled way. When dessert came around, everyone was still buzzing about Kasha and her luck. That's when I decided to speak. I cleared my throat and casually said, "Actually, I wanted to share something about the house." The room went quiet immediately. Kasha gave me a teasing smile, clearly expecting some small joke or a tease, but I just kept going. "I closed on it last month," I said, keeping my tone calm. "The house my parents have always talked about selling? It's mine now." For a few seconds, there was this stunned silence, like the air had been sucked out of the room. My parents' faces went pale, Kasha froze mid-smile, and even my cousins didn't know what to say. The whole family shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could see the shock, the anger, and, honestly, a little fear flicker across their faces. Kasha opened her mouth like she wanted to yell, to argue, to call me crazy, but I just sat back, calm, watching her scramble for words. The silence in the room was thick enough to taste. For a moment, nobody moved. My parents' faces were a mix of disbelief and thinly veiled panic, and Kasha's mouth moved, but no sound came out. She blinked at me like she'd just seen a ghost, and I had to resist the urge to smile. Purely out of satisfaction, not malice, though I admit it felt good. My mom was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling slightly despite her best effort to sound firm. "Brandon, what do you mean you bought it?" I took a slow sip of water before answering, letting the weight of the moment settle. "I mean exactly what I said. I've had my eye on it for years, saved up, and finally made an offer. It closed last month." Kasha's lips parted, and she let out a short, sharp laugh, more of a nervous sound than genuine amusement. "You what? That's impossible. Mom, Dad, did he really?" My parents exchanged quick glances, their expressions a mix of shame and anger. My dad cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain some control. "Well, We hadn't finalized anything for her yet. It was supposed to be her first choice. Brandon, we weren't supposed to be her first choice? I interrupted, keeping my voice level, almost serene. I don't recall anyone putting it in writing. From what I can tell, it was just talked about, dreamed about. But legally, it's mine now. The way my words hung in the air, the room felt colder. My cousin Mira, who had always subtly sided with Kasia, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Even she couldn't hide her surprise this time. Kasia's face turned red, a mix of fury and embarrassment. This isn't fair. You don't get it handed to you like that. I let the statement sit for a beat. Funny thing, I said slowly. I've been waiting my whole life for something to be handed to me. But you know what? That never happened. So I worked for it. I saved for it. I did it myself. She opened her mouth again, probably to argue, but this time my dad cut in. His voice was low, tense, but trying to maintain authority. Brandon, you shouldn't be flaunting this. Kasia, she's always had her sights on that property. It would have made things simpler. Simpler. I repeated. Simpler for whom? Certainly not me. For years, I've watched her get praise for things I worked just as hard for. For years, I've watched her get opportunities, financial help, recognition. And now you're telling me it would have been simpler if I just stepped aside? That's rich. The words seemed to sting more than I expected. My mom clutched her hands in front of her mouth, blinking rapidly. Kasia was pale, but her fury was starting to bubble over, the kind that can't be stopped by logic or reason. You can't just take everything from me. This was mine. It's my turn for once. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but steady, almost like a teacher correcting a student. Kasia, this isn't about taking. This is about finally getting something I earned, something I fought for. You've had everything handed to you for so long. You've forgotten what it means to work for it. I didn't take it from you. I took it for myself. The air in the room shifted again. Some of the younger cousins, who had been quietly watching, whispered among themselves, looking at their parents for guidance. But my parents didn't say much. They were frozen, caught between loyalty to Kasia and the undeniable fact that I was in the right. Kasia's voice rose, and suddenly, she was pacing in the living room, hands flailing. This is ridiculous. How did you even get the money? You're still at the same job. You couldn't possibly have. I held up a hand, not out of politeness, but to pause the chaos. I told you I saved. Every penny, every bonus, every side job I could take. I made sacrifices I didn't have to brag about because no one was watching. No one handed me anything. You, on the other hand, have had everything on a silver platter since the day you were born. Kasia stopped pacing for a moment, her chest heaving. You're ruining everything. Mom, Dad, do something. My mom's eyes filled with a mix of frustration and panic, like she was seeing the daughter she favored unravel in front of her. My dad ran a hand through his hair, muttering, we didn't think he'd do it before her. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a sense of quiet triumph. Not gloating, exactly, but it was satisfying to watch the power dynamic finally shift, even if just slightly. Kasia was still sputtering, trying to find the words to fight back, but there weren't any that could undo what was already done. And then came the moment that made the room almost unbearable. Kasia, in a last-ditch effort to reassert her control, stormed up to my parents and whispered something sharply. I couldn't hear the words exactly, but their faces went from panic to outright horror. Mira gasped, covering her mouth. My mom's eyes widened, my dad's jaw tightened. I didn't know what she said, but whatever it was clear she had just thrown a new, dangerous twist into the mix. I could feel the tension spike even higher, like a rope pulled to the breaking point. Then, Kasia turned back toward me, her eyes blazing, her voice shaking with fury. You think this is over, Brandon? You haven't seen anything yet. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. And that's when I realized the next chapter of this confrontation wasn't just about the house. Kasia was planning a move that could make my victory short-lived, and my parents weren't going to stop her. The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't stunned awe. It was fear. Everyone could feel the storm about to hit. I sat there, calm, letting it all hang in the air. Because I knew one thing for certain. She had underestimated me, just like she always did. The message on my phone made my stomach tighten. I hadn't even realized I'd unlocked it during the tense silence. It was from an unknown number, but the name attached was unmistakable: Kasha. The message itself was brief, almost innocuous on the surface, but the undertone was sharp, threatening. You think you've won? We'll see about that. Don't think this is the end, Brandon. I'm just getting started. I read it once, twice, then set the phone down on the table, deliberately letting it be visible. My family noticed immediately. Kasha's lips twitched, like she was trying to hide satisfaction at my visible reaction, but it didn't work. My parents looked between the two of us, panic creeping in again. Mira, my cousin, gave me a worried glance, like she wasn't sure which side to take. Or maybe she was terrified of what Kasha might do next. Kasha, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair, smirking slightly, trying to regain the composure she always wore like armor. See? Even now, I'm ahead of you. You think a house and some savings make you untouchable? I took a deep breath, keeping my tone calm but steady, and said, Kasha, I'm not worried. I worked for what I have. You've been given things your entire life, and yet you act like the world owes you more. Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Brandon, you don't get it. I have ways. Ways that you can't even imagine. That house. That's just the beginning. You think buying it yourself changes anything? You're in my world now, and I don't lose. My parents exchanged another glance, the kind that says, we should have stopped this a long time ago, but it was too late. Whatever storm Kasha was about to unleash was beyond their control. My mom opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. No, let her speak. I want to hear it, I said, keeping my voice calm, almost neutral, but inside I was alert, bracing for the next move. Kasha's smirk returned, though there was a glint of something darker in her eyes. You think I'm just going to sit here and let you take the family's legacy from me? That house was meant to be mine. Everything I've worked toward, every plan I've made. It doesn't just vanish because you finally decided to play the adult. I know things you don't, Brandon. Secrets. Connections. And I can use them. All of them. Against you. The air grew heavier, and I noticed even the cousins who had been chatting quietly at the side were now frozen, watching the exchange. Myra's hand hovered near her mouth, her eyes wide, and I could tell she was wondering whether Kasha might actually go too far. I leaned back slightly, trying to project calm and control, because panic would only give her the upper hand. Kasha, go ahead. Use your connections, spill your secrets, whatever you think will hurt me. It won't work. You've underestimated what I've been capable of all these years. Her expression faltered for just a moment. I caught it, a flicker of uncertainty, but it was quickly replaced by anger. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor, making everyone flinch. You don't understand. You have no idea what I'm capable of. And when I'm done, you won't have anything. Not the house, not respect, not anything. You'll regret ever thinking you could step into my world. I could see my parents shift uneasily in their seats. My dad muttered under his breath. We didn't know she'd go this far. My mom's hands were shaking slightly, the first real sign I'd ever seen that they were scared of her. And in that moment, I realized something. Kasha had always been the puppet master, manipulating everyone around her, and now that she felt threatened, she was ready to pull every string she could find. Then she did something that made my stomach drop. Kasha pulled out her phone and started typing furiously, muttering to herself. I couldn't see the screen, but I could feel the shift in the room. The cousins exchanged worried glances. Even my parents seemed frozen in fear, like they were waiting for some unspeakable revelation. After what felt like an eternity, Kasha looked up, her eyes scanning the room. You'll see. Everyone will see. By tomorrow, this reunion, this family, it won't feel the same. And Brandon, you'll realize just how small your victory really is. A cold silence followed. Nobody dared speak. Mira was the first to break eye contact with her entirely, shifting uncomfortably. My parents' expressions were unreadable, a mix of shame, fear, And something else, regret, perhaps, for having favored Kasha for so long. I remained calm on the surface, but inside I was calculating. I had spent years planning, saving, and thinking strategically. I knew Kasha's arrogance would make her overconfident. But now, it was becoming clear that this wasn't just about her ego. This was about power, about control. And she wasn't afraid to drag the entire family into it to get what she wanted. Then my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it, and my heart skipped a beat. Another message. This time, it wasn't from Kasha directly. It was from someone I didn't recognize, but the content made the blood drain from my face. We've been watching. She's planning something bigger than you think. Be careful. I looked up, and suddenly, the family room didn't feel like it had walls. It felt like a cage. Kasha was still smirking, oblivious to the fact that she'd just made a mistake revealing that she had people watching her moves. Or maybe she didn't care. But now I knew this had escalated far beyond a simple rivalry over a house. The tension was palpable. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting to see how I would respond. Kasha's threat had hung in the air like a storm cloud, and I realized that whatever I did next would determine not just my victory over her, but how this entire family would survive the fallout. I could feel my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to remain calm. I knew the next move would define everything. And as I sat there, phone in hand, I understood something crucial. Kasha had just stepped into a game she couldn't fully control, and neither could my parents. The air never really settled after that night. Kasha's little threat, veiled, smug, meant to scare, had the exact opposite effect on me. For the first time in my life, I felt less like the sidelined kid and more like someone who had finally figured out the rules of the game. I could have responded in the moment with a speech, with a triumphant gloat, with something to puncture her ego and leave her gasping. Instead, I did what I always did when stakes mattered. I let the moment sit. I let people stew in it, and I started moving in silence. That week was an exercise in patience. Kasha broadcasted the usual venom on social media. Photos of her in expensive places, comments about new adventures, and how life rewarded the bold. She texted my parents several times a day, alternating between false charm and thinly veiled panic. My mom answered her every time. My dad pretended not to notice. I let them all think I was rattled. I wasn't. I was planning. First, information. I needed to know what Kasha actually had, the scope of her connections, the leverage she claimed to possess. So I called the one person nobody expected me to call, Mira. She'd always been on Kasha's side socially, but she'd never been cruel. When I asked her to meet for coffee, she came with an apologetic look and a nervous laugh, as if she'd been waiting to be dragged into a family war and finally had a reason to speak her mind. "What are you doing, Brandon?" she asked, stirring her cappuccino like it might make this less real. Kasha wasn't joking. She has people. People who can make things difficult. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm trying to map what difficult looks like. Who are these people? What's their angle? What's the worst thing she could do?" I watched her eyes for tells. Mira had always been tactile. Her face gave away more than her words. "She's been cozying up to people in real estate for years," Mira admitted, voice low. "And there was that time 2 summers ago when she was meeting with someone at the country club, booked out, said it was about investments. No one knew who he was. She's also been friendly with a woman from the bank, Lauren, who handles loans for local properties. And there's talk she's been whispering about some old debts my uncle had. If she drags up some financial skeleton, she might try to freeze things." It was the exact sort of thing I needed. Not because I was afraid, though I was sensible, but because revenge without an understanding of the battlefield is reckless. Revenge properly executed is a correction, not an act of wild vindictiveness. Second, allies. Mira surprised me in ways she hadn't before. After that coffee, she started passing along small, careful pieces of information. Texts Kasha had sent in confidence, an email chain where Kasha flattered a realtor with a promise of long-term partnership, even a voicemail where Kasha muttered about nosing around the title when she thought no one else was listening. None of it was explosive on its own, but together it sketched a picture. Kasha had been quietly cultivating influence around the family property for years. She tried to convert goodwill into paperwork. Third, control. I tightened things up on my end. I had the house inspected the weekend after the reunion. Nothing dramatic. I was protecting an asset, not staging a takeover. I changed 2 locks and had a simple alarm system installed. Not because I was paranoid, but because people who feel entitled often try to reclaim what they think is rightfully theirs the first second they're denied. I told my real estate agent to forward any inquiries to me directly and to freeze any negotiation until she talked to me first. When I did this, the agent, an obliging, efficient woman named Tamsin, admitted, offhand, that Kasha had called her a few weeks ago, vague about intention, but very clear the house was in the family fold and that there should be a way to make this work. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a hardline focus I'd never had before. I wrote down everything Kasha could possibly do to undermine me: title challenges, trumped-up liens, emotional manipulation that could lead to blackmail, and then I checked off ways to counter each move. Some of it was practical: proper documentation, escrow, a short note from my bank confirming my mortgage terms. Some of it was psychological: a quiet, persistent narrative that I was the one who had worked, saved, and earned this, told to the right ears in the right tone. People believe a story if it's told calmly and repeatedly. They distrust those who shout. The first real strike came a week later. Kasha emailed my parents at dawn, an urgent message about an old family debt that had allegedly been overlooked in estate planning. She suggested they might be liable if the property transferred. She attached a mess of documents and a note from a lawyer, carefully generic, ambiguous, designed to terrify. My parents panicked and called me. Their voices were small on the phone, coded in a new, brittle fear. They asked me if I had taken something without telling them, and whether Kasha could do anything. I listened and allowed myself to be conciliatory, all the while filing the documents the moment I hung up. They were a mess of forms and passion, but nothing legally binding. It smelled like a scare tactic. Kasha had probably purchased the form or persuaded someone to draft it in haste. Still, I didn't dismiss it publicly. I had my attorney, one I'd met quietly through a contractor friend, review everything. The attorney wrote a clear, short letter. Everything in order, the transfer valid, the alleged debt either non-existent or irrelevant to the property's title. I printed the letter and handed copies to my parents personally, in person, because public comm is more convincing face-to-face than from a distance. Kasha's next moves were petty and precise. She tried to poison the well socially, sending private messages to mutual friends about how Brandon took advantage of the family. She sent a curated set of photographs to our extended relatives, twisted images that suggested I'd been secretive, shady. People began to murmur. The humiliation was the point. She hoped that social pressure would force me to step back. It didn't. I countered with quiet facts: photos of me signing closing documents with witnesses, text messages confirming the timeline, Tamsin's email confirming there had been no backdoor deal. Every time she lobbed a rumor, I brought truth, measured, calm, and always in writing. But the weapon that really rattled me was a series of calls to my workplace. HR called one morning. Someone claiming to be a distant relative had left a voicemail alleging impropriety around the purchase. My supervisor called me into his office with a sympathetic look, asking questions that felt like interrogation but were just due diligence. My stomach dropped in a way it hadn't since college exam seasons. Reputation is fragile, and Kasha knew that. Here's where the plan shifted from defense to offense. Kasha had optics and whispers. She had connections that moved rumors. I had patience, witnesses, and, most importantly, documentation. The next phase required a little theater. Not for me, for her. People who believe themselves entitled are often spectacularly performative. They think the loudest lie wins. So I prepared one for her. I set a date: the family dinner where the extended relatives would be in town for a holiday the following month. Not a reunion. She'd tried to weaponize those before, but a smaller, supposedly casual gathering that Kasha would surely show up to flaunt. I invited a few people I trusted: Mira, Tamsin, who agreed to come undercover as a friend, my contractor, and the attorney who'd cleared the title. I told them all to keep cool, to act surprised if Kasia launched her usual performance, and to be ready to produce calm, indisputable proof. I wanted the reveal to be quiet and precise, like a scalpel. No shouting, no spectacle, just the slow tightening of logic until the lies had nowhere left to hide. The day came. The house smelled of roast and lemon polish. My parents were tense in a way that suggested they were torn, shame-shadowed with loyalty. Kasia swept in with the practiced ease of someone who never expects to be challenged. She was joking with relatives, trading those little, conversational lies that make the rounds at family tables. I sat at the end of the table, a plate untouched, the guests arranged like chess pieces. Myra's eyes met mine across the room and gave a subtle nod. Tamsin settled into the chair beside my mom, her expression neutral, which was exactly what I wanted. Conversation drifted, as family conversations do, football scores, work gripes, a cousin's new baby, until Kasia steered it, as always, to her triumphs. She spoke about a charity gala she'd planned, the network she'd cultivated, the kindness she'd shown by suggesting the house be hers. She laughed, and a few relatives laughed with her, partly out of habit, partly out of fear. That was my opening. I could feel everyone's attention shift as I set down my fork and spoke in a calm voice that cut through the ambient noise. Before dessert, I said, there's something I want everyone to see. I reached into my jacket and set 3 things on the table in front of me: a printed copy of the title, the letter from my attorney, and a short legal summary Tamsin had prepared confirming the timeline of offers and communications. Kasia's smile faltered. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but the room reacted. Heads turned. The air tightened. For a second, I felt like the whole world was holding its breath. She recovered first with a laugh that had no mirth in it. "Really, Brandon? We're doing this here?" she asked, trying to make it a joke. But her voice wavered. I met her gaze directly. "Really," I said. "And if you have anything to add, anything at all, I'd like to hear it now." Her face hardened. There was a long, slow silence before she opened her mouth. "You think papers and lawyers make you a better person? They don't change the fact you stole something that should have been ours," she said, pacing the line between accusation and breakdown. That's when my phone buzzed. I almost didn't look at it, but the room was already cranked to a voltage I couldn't ignore. I glanced down and saw an unknown number with a short message preview that made my stomach drop. Photographs. Then the sender name, Kasia. I watched Kasia's jaw clench as she saw me looking at my screen. She smiled then, sharp, triumphant, and reached for her purse like someone about to present a final, fatal piece of evidence. Only I beat her to it. I stood, my voice low and steady. "Before you do anything, Kasia, there's one thing you should know." I hit play on a small recording I'd made 3 days earlier, the voicemail she'd left for my dad, the one where she whispered about old debts and finding a way, and where her tone slipped from charming to venomous for a heartbeat. The voice was clear, the words were damning. I had it transcribed. I slid the transcript across the table to my dad, to my mom, to the relatives with furrowed brows. Her hand froze mid-reach. The smile vanished. The photograph she'd planned to brandish like a dagger hovered uselessly in her grasp. It was the kind of small, precise move that changes a conversation from hearsay to fact. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. But the look on Kasia's face, betrayal, rage, and finally, the cold panic of someone who realizes they've been outmaneuvered, was worth all the quiet work. She inhaled sharply, the kind of breath a person takes before they throw a punch. Then she said, very quietly, "You're playing a dangerous game, Brandon." I met her without flinch. "So are you." The knock at the door cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone at the table froze. Kasia's eyes darted toward the sound, then back to me, and I could see the panic simmering beneath her carefully constructed veneer. My parents looked almost apologetic, like they had finally realized the consequences of enabling her for decades. Mira remained calm, but I could see the tension in her jaw. I stood and walked to the door, holding myself steady. Through the peephole, I could see a man in a dark suit holding a briefcase. He nodded politely to me as I opened the door. "Brandon Sanders?" he asked, extending his hand. I'm Thomas Caldwell, an auditor with the county. I have some documents here for verification regarding the Sanders family property, and I was told to deliver them personally. Kasia stiffened, and my parents flinched. I recognized immediately what this was. The formalities confirming that the property transfer was beyond challenge, that no prior claims could interfere, that all the contingencies she had hoped to exploit were legally null. I invited Thomas in, and he began methodically presenting the documents. Kasia hovered behind him, trying to read the papers over his shoulder. My parents muttered under their breath, clearly realizing they were witnessing the moment when all their favoritism and scheming could no longer shield Kasia. Thomas looked at me directly and said, "Everything has been verified. The transfer of 1124 Evergreen Lane is final, complete, and uncontested. There are no liens, no claims, no outstanding debts that could affect this property. Any prior verbal agreements, intentions, or hopes your family had are legally irrelevant." Kasia's jaw dropped slightly. She opened her mouth to protest, but Thomas raised a hand politely. "I'm afraid the law doesn't entertain wishes. The property is now yours, Mr. Sanders." I thanked him calmly and guided him out, closing the door behind him. As soon as the click of the lock echoed, the room felt like it exhaled, though the atmosphere was still thick with tension. Kasia sank into a chair, shoulders slumped, no words coming. She looked like a hurricane that had run out of wind. I turned back to the table, addressing my parents first. "You both should understand something," I said. "This isn't about punishment. This is about accountability. For years, Kasia has been rewarded for everything she wanted, regardless of effort, and you both encouraged it. I've worked my whole life to get what I earned. The difference now is that everyone can see the result." My mom opened her mouth, but I cut her off. "No explanations. No apologies. You enabled her behavior, and now you're seeing the consequences. That's it." Kasia finally looked up at me, eyes red from suppressed frustration. "You think this changes anything, Brandon?" she hissed. I smiled faintly, shaking my head. "No, it changes everything. And you're finally going to learn that life doesn't owe you a thing, not even family. Your luck ran out the day you underestimated me." Her fury was palpable, but at that point, it was impotent. The room had shifted completely. My relatives whispered among themselves, some with confusion, others with a grudging respect for what I had done. Mira gave me a small, proud nod, and even my parents couldn't argue. They had seen the legal confirmation, the documented proof, and my calm, strategic handling of every one of Kasia's moves. Over the next few days, Kasia tried to salvage some semblance of control. She sent messages, attempted phone calls, and even tried to appeal to mutual friends, but everyone had seen the evidence. Her words no longer carried weight. My parents, embarrassed and shaken, stopped taking her calls immediately, realizing that siding with her now only reflected badly on them. I continued to live in the house I had worked for, making improvements quietly and steadily, while Kasia floundered. Her social influence evaporated. Friends who had tolerated her arrogance began to drift away, unimpressed with her petty manipulations and constant threats. The few relatives who had cheered her on now saw her true nature, a pattern of entitlement, manipulation, and cruelty. Months later, my life had settled into a peaceful rhythm I hadn't known was possible. The house was mine in every sense, fully documented, fully secure. Kasia, meanwhile, was effectively cut off. She had burned bridges with almost every relative who had once supported her, and my parents' relationship with her was strained to the point of near estrangement. Every attempt she made to regain influence or access to the house ended in failure. I didn't gloat publicly, and I didn't need to. The knowledge that I had outmaneuvered a lifetime of entitlement was enough. Kasia's downfall wasn't spectacular, but it was absolute. The family dynamics had shifted. For the first time, my parents could no longer ignore the reality of who I was and what I could achieve, and they finally recognized that their favoritism had created more problems than it had solved. And as for Kasia, she remained a cautionary tale within the family, someone whose entitlement, arrogance, and manipulations had finally caught up with her. I never spoke to her again beyond necessary formalities, and I ensured the house remained legally untouchable. Every move she made to challenge me failed, and eventually, even the threats stopped coming. In the end, I got what I had worked for. I finally had a place I could call my own, free of favoritism, free of manipulation. My parents, once blind to the inequality in their household, were left to confront the consequences of their choices. And Kasha, well, she had nothing left but her own ego and the knowledge that for once, she wasn't the one in control. I didn't forgive them. I didn't pretend to. They had been villains in my story for as long as I could remember, and I allowed them to see the results of their favoritism and manipulation firsthand. Justice, in my view, didn't require malice. It required patience, strategy, and resolve. And after years of being sidelined, I finally had all three. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. Hi everyone, my name's Gerald, and I need to get this off my chest because honestly, I don't think anyone outside my family would ever understand the kind of treatment I got growing up. I guess I should start at the beginning. I have an older brother, Darren. He's 3 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, my parents have treated him like some kind of golden child. I'm not exaggerating. Everything he wanted, everything he needed, my parents were there with a credit card or a chauffeur or whatever it took. Me? I was the background, the afterthought, the one they compared to him every single day. It all came to a head the summer I turned 21. Darren had just graduated college, again, thanks to my parents covering every expensive course, tutoring, and even his internships when he couldn't get them on his own. To celebrate, my parents bought him a brand new sports car. Not a nice used car, not something reasonable. A brand new, top-of-the-line sports car that cost more than I'd make in a year if I worked 3 full-time jobs. I walked into the garage that morning, expecting maybe a quiet congratulations for him. But instead, my mom smirked at me and said, "Well, Gerald, you'll never have something like this. Maybe you should focus on something you can get." I froze. It wasn't the first time they'd said something like that, but this time it was different. It wasn't a passing comment or a sigh about my failures. It was deliberate, calculated. They wanted me to feel small. Darren, of course, was oblivious. He hugged them, revved the engine like a little kid, and drove off while I just stood there in silence. I couldn't even speak. The resentment that had been simmering inside me for years suddenly exploded. That night, I packed a small bag. I left without telling anyone where I was going. I wasn't running away to be dramatic. I was leaving to take control of my life. I rented a tiny apartment downtown, got a job in a small tech company, and for the first time, made choices that were purely mine. No one hovering over me, no one comparing me to my brother, no one putting me in some shadow. At first, it was hard, really hard. I had no safety net, no family to fall back on. I worked late nights, skipped weekends, learned everything I could about investing, business, and strategy. Every insult, every condescending look, every comment about how I'll never be as good as Darren fueled me. I didn't just want to succeed, I wanted to do it on my own terms, far away from them. Years went by. I didn't contact my parents or Darren. I blocked their calls for a while because I realized talking to them just reminded me of who I was supposed to be, according to them. I started building my own small businesses, focusing on tech and real estate, reinvesting every penny I earned. Slowly, methodically, I built something that was entirely mine. Then came last week. I was walking through a private terminal at the airport, ready to board my own jet. A jet I had purchased outright after years of working, investing, and planning, when I saw Darren. Of course, he didn't recognize me at first. He was with my mom, who had been nagging him about some trivial family emergency or whatever excuse she could think of to drag him into their drama-filled orbit. The moment he saw the jet with my name on it, his jaw dropped. His face turned pale. He stepped back as if the plane itself had punched him. And then, like a child who had just lost his favorite toy, he picked up his phone and called my mom. "Mom, how did he get that?" His voice cracked, panicked. He has a jet? He owns it? This isn't possible." My mom, of course, smiled. That smug, satisfied smile she always wore when Darren was shocked or hurt. "Well, Gerald made his choices, she said casually. Maybe if you stopped expecting things handed to you, you could do the same. Darren hung up, his face white, shaking. And that's when I realized just how far I'd come, and how painfully obvious it must have been to him that I had done everything he had gotten handed to him. But I'd done it myself. After that day at the airport, I didn't contact my parents. I didn't even reach out to Darren. For the first time in years, I just let the shock sit. Watching him flail and realize that I had beaten him at the one thing our parents had always promised he would excel at. It was almost poetic. Almost. But I wasn't satisfied yet. I knew him too well. He wouldn't just accept this quietly. He'd try to claw his way back, and I needed to be ready. I spent the next few weeks carefully planning. Every interaction with my parents had to be deliberate. I wasn't going to call, text, or email. I let them stew in curiosity, frustration, and the invisible walls I had built around myself. And of course, Darren, being the entitled little storm cloud he was, started making inquiries. At first, it was subtle. My mom called once, asking if I could stop by for a family dinner. I ignored it. Then came the texts, all passive-aggressive, sugar-coated statements. "We miss you at home. Darren is asking when you'll come around." I didn't reply. My parents didn't know where I lived. The address I had carefully kept secret was exactly that, a secret. But Darren didn't let it go. He started calling my company. He somehow found out the name of my businesses and tried to contact me through work, asking to meet and talk about family matters. I smiled when I saw the voicemail. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. Every pause, every stammer, every sharp inhale was pure panic. The same panic I had felt when I was 21, standing in the garage watching him drive away in a car I'd never have. Only now the roles were reversed. I decided it was time to escalate. Not by replying, "Oh no," that would have been too obvious, but by showing my success in ways that couldn't be ignored. I started arranging small, public appearances, charity galas, tech conferences, openings for properties I had developed. Every time I appeared, photographs surfaced online, tagged with my name and my businesses. Darren, always obsessed with competition, noticed immediately. He called my mom again, voice trembling. "Mom, why is he at all these events? He's everywhere. How does he even have time? How is he?" The questions trailed off. She interrupted him, chuckling in that way that made her sound both amused and superior. "Darren, Gerald made choices," she said. "You always had the option to make your own, but you wanted everything handed to you. Maybe someday you'll understand that, but for now, just enjoy watching him thrive." He hung up, face red, hands shaking, and I watched from my side of the city, knowing exactly what he felt. That gnawing panic, that realization that life wasn't going to spoon-feed him anymore. That control had shifted entirely. But I wasn't done. No, this was just the beginning. I started planning a move that would cement my independence and simultaneously crush the last remnants of their arrogance. The big reveal had to be impossible to ignore. It had to be public enough that they would have no choice but to face it, yet intimate enough that it would sting personally. It all started with the idea of a property auction. Over the past few years, I had quietly invested in a number of high-end properties. Some I flipped, some I rented, some I held on to because the value was climbing steadily. One of them was an enormous estate in the city's wealthiest district, a place that had belonged to a well-known family, restored and redeveloped, and I had purchased it in secret. I invited my parents and Darren, anonymously at first, to what I called a private viewing for potential investors. I knew Darren wouldn't be able to resist the curiosity, and my parents, ever so desperate to show off their control, agreed to tag along. They didn't know whose event it was. They didn't know that every person they would see inside the estate, every valet, every staff member, and every decorative flourish was mine. The day of the viewing, I arrived early. Standing in the grand foyer, watching the sun hit the marble floors just right, I felt a calmness I had never experienced with my family around. The house was perfect, not ostentatious, but elegant, impressive, and unmistakably expensive. I had arranged it to feel lived in, but aspirational, the kind of property that screamed success without shouting it. And then I saw them. Darren, followed by my mom, walking down the long driveway. I stayed in the shadows at first, letting them wander, letting their eyes widen as they slowly began to understand the magnitude of what they were seeing. They walked through the entrance, and I heard Darren mutter under his breath, this can't be real." My mom's expression shifted from curiosity to polite intrigue, masking the fact that her pride in his entitlement was being slowly replaced with shock. They wandered through the rooms, admiring the fixtures, the art, the carefully curated furniture. And then they came into the main hall, where I finally revealed myself. I stepped out of the shadows, calm, collected, dressed simply but elegantly, the kind of presence that immediately drew attention without needing to speak. Darren froze. His eyes went wide. You own this?" he asked, barely audible, as though speaking louder might make it vanish. I nodded. "Every inch, every brick, every detail, all mine." My mom's smile faltered. She always had that ability to recover quickly, to mask shock with an expression of superiority. But this time it didn't stick. Her hands trembled slightly, and I could see the calculation running through her head. How had I built this? How had I managed this without their guidance, without their help, without their credit cards? Darren didn't even wait for an answer. He turned to her, voice shaking, almost breaking. "Mom, how did he do this? How is this even possible?" I let the silence linger, savoring the moment. The truth was simple: patience, strategy, and refusing to let them define me. But Darren and my parents didn't need to hear the explanation. The image, the presence, the reality of it all. It was enough to upend their expectations, to leave them questioning every decision they had ever made, and to make Darren feel the first real taste of being powerless in his own family. And yet, as I watched them standing there, I realized something important. The satisfaction I expected, the full, visceral thrill of seeing them humbled, wasn't complete. No, the real story wasn't finished yet. There was still one move left, one that would guarantee that my victory was absolute, one that would finally put every single entitled expectation they had in its proper place. But making that move meant stepping fully into the spotlight, orchestrating a plan that was risky, delicate, and perfect. It meant letting them see not just my success, but the truth about who I had become, and how completely independent I was from the life they had tried to control me with. After that first encounter at the estate, I retreated back into my life. I didn't call or message them. I didn't even let Darren know I had seen the effect my presence had on him. That would have been too easy for him to dismiss. No, I wanted to make sure the next move landed perfectly, with maximum impact. I spent the next 2 months quietly building what I now consider the masterstroke of my strategy: the launch of my own private investment fund. Not just any fund, but a high-profile, invitation-only venture that would attract wealthy clients, entrepreneurs, and media attention. Every step of the process was calculated. I wanted this to be public enough that my success could no longer be ignored, but personal enough that my parents and Darren would feel the sting of exclusion firsthand. During this period, I also refined my interactions with Darren. Whenever I received inquiries through mutual contacts, I replied vaguely, always polite, never revealing more than necessary. I could sense his desperation growing. He started showing up at events I knew he couldn't get into legitimately, trying to bump into me at charity functions or networking dinners. My parents, of course, tagged along with him sometimes, looking to assert some semblance of control. But by now, I had grown into a version of myself they had never seen: confident, composed, and untouchable in ways that left them unsure of how to react. One evening, about a week before the official launch of my fund, I decided to invite my parents to dinner. Not at a restaurant, not in public, at my penthouse. I kept it casual in tone, almost offhand, in a message that made it sound like it was nothing out of the ordinary. They accepted immediately, probably assuming that it was another opportunity to parade Darren's supposed superiority or to remind me that I was still under their thumb in some way. The night of the dinner, I had arranged everything with meticulous care. My penthouse was elegantly understated. Expensive, yes, but not gaudy. The table was set for 3: me, my mother, and my father. Darren, of course, was nowhere near the apartment yet. He wasn't invited. That would come later. They arrived on time, as punctuality seemed to be one of the few traits they actually valued. My mother's eyes widened slightly when she stepped into the living room. I could see her taking in the space, the artwork, the furniture, the subtle displays of wealth and taste, and trying to reconcile it with the image of the obedient, struggling Gerald they had carried around in their heads for years. "Wow," she murmured. "This is impressive." I smiled politely, guiding them to the dining area. "Thank you. I've put a lot of time into making it my own." Dinner was quiet at first, formal. My parents exchanged glances, subtle signs of the confusion and frustration simmering beneath the surface. My father kept trying to steer the conversation toward Darren, asking questions about his latest ventures, subtly reminding me of my place as the younger, less successful sibling. I let it slide, listening, nodding, and occasionally commenting, all the while plotting my next move. After the main course, I stood and excused myself for a moment. When I returned, I had something in my hand, a small envelope. I placed it on the table in front of my mother. Her brows furrowed. "What's this?" she asked, reaching for it. I let the silence stretch. "Open it," I said calmly. Inside was an invitation, a sleek, professionally printed card for the launch of my investment fund, scheduled for the coming week. The names of several high-profile attendees were listed, people I knew my parents would recognize immediately. They would understand, the moment they read the list, that I was operating in a sphere far above the one they had imagined for me, or for Darren. My mother's hand shook slightly as she passed it to my father. I watched their expressions closely, taking in the subtle mix of disbelief, panic, and barely controlled anger. "You're running this yourself?" my father asked finally, his voice low. "All of it," I nodded. "Every bit. I've been working toward this for years. I've built my own team, sourced my own investors, and planned every detail myself. I wanted you to see it before the public launch." My mother's eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment, I thought I saw the faintest hint of respect. Then it vanished, replaced by something colder, calculating, almost fearful. "And Darren?" she asked cautiously, her tone trying to regain some sense of authority. "He wasn't invited," I said simply. "This is my achievement, my event. There's no reason for him to be part of it." The tension in the room was palpable. My parents, used to controlling every narrative in the family, were suddenly confronted with the reality that there was a part of my life they had no access to, no influence over. They looked at each other, silently debating what to say next, how to regain some semblance of dominance. But it was too late. I had already taken that power away from them. The next few days were a blur of planning and anticipation. I focused on every detail of the launch, making sure the media coverage would be flawless and that Darren and my parents, if they tried to follow, would see exactly what they had missed. I even arranged for a few subtle hints to reach mutual acquaintances, friends of Darren, minor contacts my parents liked to boast about, to mention the scale of my work, the sophistication of the launch, and the caliber of people attending. On the day of the launch, I arrived early, walking through the space I had meticulously prepared. The room was elegant, modern, yet approachable, filled with the right balance of clients, press, and partners. Every person in the room was someone who could recognize my achievements and, if they spoke to Darren or my parents later, reinforce the narrative I was carefully constructing. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. My parents arrived, escorted by a mutual acquaintance who had agreed to guide them to the event. They entered, confident at first, expecting to find a small, underwhelming gathering. But their expressions changed immediately as they took in the scene. The room was buzzing, cameras capturing moments, clients networking, and in the center, I stood, calm, collected, and in complete control of the entire operation. Darren, of course, eventually arrived, having heard about the event through a mutual contact. I didn't let him in immediately. Instead, I watched from a distance as he approached, his face pale, his steps hesitant. He recognized immediately that this wasn't just another gathering. It was a statement, a declaration of independence and achievement that he could never replicate without starting from scratch. When he finally saw me, standing confidently amidst the buzz of conversation, introductions, and deals. His entire demeanor shifted. His usual smirk, the one that had plagued me for years, was gone. His eyes widened, and his lips parted in disbelief. For a moment, I could almost hear the thoughts racing through his mind. How had I done this? How could he have missed it? How could his parents have let this happen? And in that exact moment, I realized something profound. The real power wasn't just in the jet, the estate, or the investments. It was in the control I had over my own narrative, the life I had built without them, and the fact that they were witnessing it unravel before their very eyes. I was standing at the edge of the final act, the one that would cement everything I had worked for, that would ensure my parents and Darren understood, once and for all, that I had not just escaped their favoritism, but had utterly outmaneuvered it. Then Darren did something that changed everything. He tried to interrupt me. He didn't barge in like a cartoon villain. He didn't scream or accuse me in front of everyone the way I'd pictured in some long, petty fantasy. He approached like a man trying to salvage what dignity he had left, careful, measured, as if politeness could buy him back everything his parents and life had always handed him on a silver platter. He came up behind me while I was speaking with a prospective investor and said, quiet enough so only I could hear, "Gerald, can we talk?" Privately, I felt the muscles in my neck tighten. The whole room seemed to dim around the two of us. The investor I was speaking with gave a polite nod and drifted away, leaving us an island of murmurs and clinking glasses. Darren's hand trembled when he reached for my arm. That tremor was not something I'd seen from him before. He'd always been theatrical, never nervous. Seeing him like that told me how badly he'd misread everything. "Not now," I said, and my tone was softer than I'd intended. "This is not the place." He swallowed. "It's important. Please, just 5 minutes. For the family." I looked at him, really looked. The entitlement I'd grown up under was still there in the set of his jaw, but beneath it was raw panic. His eyes landed on my suit, on the salving sheen of the event, the cameras. "Gerald," he said again. "Mom called. She's worried. She wants us to talk about finances. About the company. She thinks something's wrong." He used the word company, and my skin went cold for a second. I had anticipated this. My parents were the sort who would manufacture crises to force reconciliation, an illness, a business problem, any manufactured drama to pull me back into their orbit where they could control the narrative again. I had no intention of walking back into that world. "Send her my schedule," I said plainly. "We'll set something for next week. I'm tied up tonight." He blinked like that answer had somehow surprised him. "She's already here," he confessed, voice dropping to a whisper. "She's in the VIP lounge. She wants to talk now. She says it's urgent." The laugh that escaped me was small and sharp. "Of course she does." I could have left it there. I could have kept the image of my parents watching from the other room, puzzled and defeated, and let that be the last time they saw me on shaky ground. But something else moved under my skin, the same careful, patient thing that had gotten me this far. There was a final maneuver I'd been saving for the exact convergence of ego, expectation, and stage. "Fine," I said. 5 minutes. We walked through the crowd, and my mother rose as we approached, a practiced smile pasted in place. She looked radiant in the way my mother wore her confidence. Expensive, rehearsed, the smile of someone who'd never had to account for her choices. My father stood slightly behind her, arms folded as if this entire evening were another performance. "Gerald," she said, voice effortlessly warm. "What a surprise. We were just—" She faltered, the edge of her composure cracking when she saw my face. "Is everything all right?" I kept my expression neutral. "Everything is fine. I wanted to give you both a minute before the formal part of the night." "Oh." Her smile was thin. "Is this about Darren?" He seemed so upset when he arrived. Darren was not trying to hide his agitation. He hovered near us like a man waiting for a verdict. "We just want to understand what this is about," he said. "I mean, you didn't tell us anything. We found out from people." The murmurs in the room kept going, small, curious ripples, but the center of gravity had tightened to us. I turned slightly, scanning the crowd. Cameras angled this way and that. A few journalists I knew were taking notes. Perfect. Before I say anything, I told them, I'd like to show you something. I nodded to a member of my team, who signaled to the audiovisual staff. The lights dimmed fractionally. A flat screen near the stage flickered and then filled with an image. The old family company logo, the one Mom had polished up and used at every charity brunch, every family event email, every name drop. My mother's smile thinned completely. What is that? On screen, a presentation began, clean, unflinching. Charts. Simple facts. No flourish. Just data and documents. The kind of unglamorous proof lawyers and accountants love. It began with a headline that I'd composed myself. A strategic acquisition. Harrington Holdings. Darren's laugh was a nervous bark. You bought Harrington? He blurted. You can't. You can verify it yourself, I said. I watched his face as the slide changed to show the press release. My fund had, earlier that month, closed on a controlling stake in Harrington Holdings. The slide showed transaction dates, closing figures, and a list of immediate changes to the board. The next slide displayed one name prominently, Gerald K. Mercer, Executive Chair, Interim. The room shifted like a school of fish. Conversations frayed, then stuttered into silence. My mother pressed her hand to her chest, as if to steady a tremor. My father's face went an ashy shade I hadn't seen since I'd turned down their offer of a cushioned life. Darren looked like someone watching their favorite house get dismantled out the window. You what? He said, voice thin. You just. How did you even? You never asked, I said. You never tried. My mother's jaw worked. She stepped forward, the smile gone. Gerald, that company has been in our family for generations. We never. It's not the same company you remember, I said. They needed capital. They needed a modern strategy. I offered it. I paid fair market value. I did not raid the family. I did not hide anything. I presented a plan to the board, and they accepted it. Her face was a mask of fury folded into shame. You bought them out. From us. Without even telling us. That is. It's business, I said. And it's done. Behind my mother something shifted. Disbelief. Then a thin, rising panic she tried desperately to hide. She reached into her purse, hands shaking, and pulled out her phone. Darren saw it, and for an instant he moved toward her as if to stop her from dialing. He didn't. He had already learned, painfully, that when his mother panicked, his entitled world eroded even faster. My mother's fingers hovered over the screen. Then she looked at me with something like wounded outrage. Why? She asked, voice low but furious. Why would you do this? We are family. We would have. You never asked me to be family in the way you meant it, I answered. You asked me to be what you needed. Obedient, small, grateful. I chose differently. The auditorium felt smaller. The air tasted metallic. I could see the press in the back lean in, the subtle posture of people who had smelled a story. The board members I'd invited gave each other a discreet, pleased look. This was worse for them than for me. This was the first time in a long time that the people who thought they could arrange the world had been rearranged. Darren went pale, then red, like a bad sunburn blooming from the inside out. You can't, he tried to laugh it off. You can't just, what are you going to do? Replace us? Close the family philanthropy? Throw us out? I had planned for him to say that. I had phrased my next move to land precisely on his worst fears. My voice was steady as I explained the next slide, the one that made my mother sway backwards, made the grip on her phone tighten so hard her knuckles whitened. As part of the restructuring, I said, we are aligning Harrington with contemporary governance practices. That includes auditing legacy contracts, reassessing leadership roles, and, where necessary, changing titles and responsibilities. We will be inviting new leadership to consult on operational updates. I let the phrase hang. It was euphemistic legalese meant to bury the pole in soft foam, but the point was clear. The people who had treated Harrington like a family trophy were about to find themselves with less influence than they had always assumed. I watched their faces as the implication landed. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father's expression was gone, replaced by a hunted look I recognized like an old scar. Darren's mouth trembled. You can't do this, he said finally. You're not one of them. You're not. I am, I said. I am one of them enough to know how to fix it. That was the moment the room flurried into motion. Phones came out. People whispered. A reporter at the far end of the room raised a hand and asked a question that made my stomach lurch with the kind of delicious anxiety I'd worked years to cultivate. Will there be layoffs? She asked, voice professional, sharp. I answered calmly, because I had already rehearsed how this would sound. We are conducting an assessment. Any decisions will be made to ensure the long-term viability of the company. We owe that to our employees and our investors. That was the public line. The private line was simpler. I had just put the people who had used me as a punching bag in a position where they might lose not just prestige, but actual power and income. The thought of that, of them forced to reckon with consequences they had always outsourced, felt like settling an old debt. Darren's face crumpled, like someone who'd realized he'd been living in a house of cards that another person had been quietly removing the glue from. He looked at my parents, pleading. Tell them to stop, he begged. Tell them that this is too much. Gerald, don't, please. My mother's hand trembled over the phone. For the first time since I'd left at 21, I saw my mother unsure. She looked at the crowd, at the cameras, at the board members who'd accepted the offer I'd placed on the table. And then, finally, she looked at me. Gerald, she said, voice brittle. This is cruel. I let my smile be small and unrepentant. This is business, I said again. And this is how you taught me to play. Darren lunged forward then, not an angry, shouting lunge, but something closer to a child's frantic grab for a cherished toy. He reached for my sleeve, fingers curling around fabric like desperate roots. You can't do this to us, he hissed. You can't take our company away from us. You're not one of them. I looked down at his hand on me and felt, honestly, none of the pity I knew other people would expect I might feel. I felt the trace memory of every small humiliation, every stinging sentence about how I would never have what Darren had, every time a parent had used a lifetime's financial cushion as a weapon instead of support. The hand closed and then fell away as my team members signaled that the press wanted a statement. Cameras swung in. The audience leaned forward. Enough, I said, voice low but carrying. This conversation can continue privately. For now, if you'd like, I can introduce you to the board members. They'll be meeting after the event. Darren staggered back, like I'd struck him. He clutched at the arm of a nearby sponsor, and then retreated, eyes wild with the kind of fear that comes not from physical danger, but from the sudden loss of a script you'd long assumed would carry you through life. My parents followed him with blank faces, their composure in tatters. They left the room not with the thunder of outrage, but with a brittle silence that spoke louder than any accusation. As they walked away, my mother's phone slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor, screen flashing with an incoming call from a family lawyer. She didn't answer it. She didn't look back. The applause that followed my brief statement felt thin to me, polite, rehearsed. People clapped because a good story had unfolded and cameras had captured it. But within that thin sound was something that had never existed when I was a kid, respect that I'd earned. Cold, quiet, deliberate respect. Later, in the hush that follows a storm that hasn't yet broken, Darren found me in a quiet corner. He looked like a man who'd had every certainty removed and had been told to plan his life anew. He was smaller than I remembered, which I suppose made sense. Privilege does not strengthen muscles. You think you're better than us now? He asked, not really a question. I stared at him for a long moment. There was a temptation to speak the things I'd rehearsed for years, accumulate every cutting truth about how he'd had things given to him and squandered them. There was also a deeper, quieter satisfaction in watching him arrive at his own understanding. No, I said finally. Better isn't the word. Different. Responsible. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. You want to run the company? Take it away from us? What will you do? Change our charity, sell the house. Take everything. I watched him as though he was finally noticing the furniture for himself. I don't need to take everything to make a point, I said. I just need to show that the life you were handed can be rebuilt by someone who was told they'd never have it. That's all. His face contorted like he was trying to translate a foreign language. And Mom, Dad, they'll just accept it. He asked it like a child asking if monsters are real. The answer is never simple. But before I could muster anything closer to compassion, another figure appeared between us. My mother, flanked now by the family lawyer she'd finally raised, her expression a mask again, but with eyes that didn't quite meet mine. "You will regret this," she said, calm as a winter lake. "We will make sure of it." There was menace in the words, threat, legacy, the clumsy confidence of people who believe money and lawyers can reclaim anything. It was almost laughable, except for the pulse of real danger beneath it. She turned to leave, then paused, and for 1 second her shoulders sagged with something like the weight of a parent worried for a son. "Darren," she said quietly, not even looking at him. "Help him. Talk to him. Make him understand." Darren's face crumpled in a way I had seen only in old photos. The one where he's 3 years old and on the receiving end of the family's coddling. He moved then, hands fumbling, and wrapped his arms around our mother in a clumsy, almost apologetic hug. It looked like theater, like the kind of performance they had perfected for their social circle. Only this time the stage had shifted beneath them. As they left the event, shepherded by acquaintances and lawyers and people who smelled drama and money, I felt that impossible thrum of triumph and apprehension buzzing under my ribs. I had pulled a public lever that exposed the whole family for what it was: imperfect, vulnerable, capable of losing things they'd treated as immutable. But revenge, as I had learned in the years I spent building this life, is never a single act. You can buy a company, announce restructuring, and coax the ground from under a family's confidence, but consequences ripple in ways you cannot always predict. There were phone calls already underway. There would be angry letters. There would be quiet sabotage, whispers among board members who resented change. There would be late-night meetings and maybe threats thinly veiled as legal advice. And there, in the hallway outside the event, with my mother's lawyer's voice still ringing in the air and Darren's small, frightened face burned into my memory, I realized that the story was not over. I had struck a blow, an effective one, but the fight had only shifted arenas. As they disappeared down the corridor, my phone buzzed with a name I had not expected to see. A former business partner who had promised loyalty years ago, but also promised nothing. Then a message from one of the Harrington executives, a terse, urgent line: "Meet me tomorrow morning." My calendar filled with meetings that could salvage or sink the move I'd made. I took a breath. The lights of the city were beginning to hatch into night beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The plane was still at the hangar, waiting. The estate would be ready for handover soon. The fund had commitments. My choices had consequences. The next morning, I woke early and went straight to my office. The city was just beginning to stir, the streets below dotted with taxis, joggers, and early commuters. But up here, in the calm of my penthouse-turned headquarters, it felt like a world apart. I had prepared for this moment for years. Every calculation, every risk, every sleepless night had been about building not just wealth, but absolute leverage. First on the agenda was Harrington Holdings. The executive who had sent the message yesterday was waiting for me in the boardroom. I walked in and immediately got to business. There were contracts to finalize, appointments to confirm, and operational decisions to make. The executives were professional, competent, and they hadn't known me as the kid my parents treated like a shadow. They treated me with respect, listened, and executed decisions without questioning my authority. That was new. That was powerful. Meanwhile, word had reached my parents quickly. My mother had already sent several frantic texts to Darren, all variations on the same theme. "You need to fix this. He cannot just take what belongs to us. Call him. Convince him. Do not let this stand." Darren, desperate as ever, tried. He called me, his voice trembling with panic, begging for explanations, pleading for compromises. I did not answer. I had nothing to explain. Every move I had made had been perfectly legal, completely justified, and entirely mine. By mid-morning, the first press inquiries arrived. Local business news picked up the acquisition story, and within hours, the story had gone national. Headlines highlighted the boldness of the move. Young entrepreneur acquires century-old family company. From background to boardroom, Gerald Mercer's rise. I watched Darren's mother, my mother, appear on video calls in hushed tones with their lawyers and family friends, trying to figure out how to undo what had already been done. The reality for them was brutal. My parents had always believed money and social status gave them control over the world, and certainly over me. But all that control evaporated the moment I built something independently of them. Their privilege, their network, their connections were no match for strategy, patience, and years of hard work. By late afternoon, Darren made a final, desperate attempt. He came to my penthouse unannounced, suit ill-fitting and hair unkempt, a mixture of fear and fury written across his face. My mother and father were not with him, but he had clearly spoken to them beforehand. He expected me to feel intimidated, maybe guilty, maybe soft enough to make concessions. He walked into the living room, stared at me, and said, almost on a whisper, "Gerald, please. You can't just take everything from us. Mom, Dad, they'll ruin you if you don't reverse this." I finally looked at him without hesitation. "Darren, everything you think I took from you is yours only in your imagination. I didn't take anything. I built my life. You squandered every opportunity handed to you. I followed the same world, but I did it differently. I earned this. You and my parents. Well, you're just realizing that life isn't a series of gifts." He staggered back, his face pale. His mouth moved, searching for words, but none came. I could see it, the exact moment when entitlement crumbles under reality. The boy who had always been my parents' pride, the one who had been given cars, credit cards, and every chance imaginable, had nothing to stand on now. And I pressed the advantage. I pulled out a document, legal, clean, undeniable, detailing the changes in Harrington's leadership. Every board member, every operational shift, every decision that reduced my parents' influence was spelled out. "This," I said, laying it on the coffee table, "is the new structure. My authority is final. Any attempts to interfere will be met with legal action. You are welcome to watch, but you will not control." Darren's knees buckled slightly. "Mom, Dad, they can do nothing," I interrupted. "You should have realized that the day I left, the day I decided to live my life on my own terms. You raised me to be smaller than Darren, but I refused. I didn't just refuse your control, I outgrew it entirely. And now, you're powerless. Every call you make, every demand, every threat, it has no weight here. None." For the first time, he cried. Not the soft, fleeting tears of a child, but the raw, unfiltered despair of someone who finally recognizes that their world has ended. My parents, watching from a distance, were furious, fuming at my audacity, my independence, my complete refusal to let them manipulate me. But there was nothing they could do. The law, the contracts, the investors, they all backed me. My parents had no recourse. Their reputation could be scratched, but their control was gone. The aftermath was slow but decisive. Harrington Holdings flourished under my guidance. I maintained the charitable efforts, the staff, the legacy of the company, but on my terms, not theirs. My parents attempted public smears, whispered threats, and even subtle sabotage through social networks, but it all failed. Each move they made was countered with legal precision, strategy, and the quiet patience I had honed over 5 years of independence. Darren, meanwhile, retreated into a shadow of the person he had been. The boy who had always been handed life now realized he would have to work, and I mean truly work, for anything he wanted. But by that point, the gap between us was unbridgeable. He had lost not only my respect, but the platform that had once been guaranteed to him. My parents tried to reach out after a few months, attempting to charm me with false apologies, veiled offers of reconciliation, or promises of recognition. Every attempt was met with polite refusal. I did not forgive them. I did not normalize their behavior. They had spent decades creating a narrative where my life was to be theirs to mold, and I had spent 5 years dismantling it piece by piece. There was no going back, and I made sure they understood that. Today, my life is steady, successful, and mine entirely. The private jet still waits at the hangar. The penthouse overlooks the city. Harrington Holdings thrives under my leadership, and every day I wake knowing that I have done what my parents and Darren never could. built a life on my own terms, free from manipulation, entitlement, and favoritism. Darren occasionally calls or texts. I ignore him. My parents send messages, attempt subtle influence, try to guilt or charm. But the dynamic is irreversibly reversed. I am no longer the background character in their story. I am the one writing the narrative now. And the most satisfying part? They know it. Every time they see a headline, every time they hear about my next move, they remember that smirk in the garage when I was told, "You'll never have that." And now, they know the truth. I didn't just have it. I surpassed it. Entirely. The family they tried to control is gone, reshaped entirely by the one they underestimated, the quiet, patient, methodical kid they tried to keep in the shadows. And in the end, they are powerless spectators to the life I built from scratch, while Darren and my parents remain reminders of entitlement left unchecked, crushed by their own inability to understand effort, strategy, and consequence. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.